The chandelier light was blinding, not because it was too bright, but because everything in that room, the marble floors, the crystal glasses, the tailored suits, was designed to make ordinary people feel small. This was not a room for ordinary people. This was the kind of room where fortunes were decided with a handshake and careers were ended with a whisper. 500 of the most powerful investors, executives, and media personalities in the country had gathered for the annual Whitmore Charitable Investment Gala. And for most of the evening, everything had gone exactly as expected. Speeches, applause, the careful theater of the wealthy performing generosity for cameras, until the host stepped to the podium, adjusted his microphone, and said 6 words that changed the energy in the entire room. Please welcome the new owner, Sarah Calloway. A woman walked through the side door in a deep navy gown, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She moved without rushing. She moved like someone who had absolutely nothing to prove and had learned that lesson the very hard way. The room applauded. Cameras flashed. And somewhere near the center of that glittering crowd, a man in a charcoal gray suit slowly stopped clapping. His wife, a striking woman in red, turned to look at him, and then she looked at the stage, and something behind her eyes shifted into something that looked very much like fear. The man's name was Dalton Pierce, and the woman in the navy gown? She had once been his wife, the woman he walked away from, the woman he called ordinary. The woman he said would never amount to anything without him. He stood there in that magnificent room, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, holding a champagne glass that had gone completely still in his hand. Because he had come to this gala for one reason. He needed her. He needed her company. He needed her money. And she was standing on that stage, holding all of it, looking like she had been born there. His face went pale, and the room began to whisper. Hey, before we go any further, if you love stories about betrayal, redemption, and the kind of comebacks that make your jaw drop, you are in exactly the right place. Welcome to this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how Sarah Calloway ended up on that stage, you need to understand everything she survived to get there. Celeste Wynn did not build her empire by being kind. She built it by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than every man who ever underestimated her. By the time she was 42, her company, Wynn Capital Group, controlled over $3 billion in assets across 11 countries. She had acquired struggling firms, restructured them with cold precision, and flipped them for profits that made headlines. Business magazines ran her photo with phrases like the ice architect and the surgeon of Wall Street. She was admired by investors, feared by competitors, and studied in business schools as both a case study in success and a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition has no ceiling. She wore her power like a second skin. She expected the best from the people around her. And when someone showed real hunger, real burning, obsessive hunger for success, she noticed. That was how she noticed Dalton Pierce. Dalton was sharp. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with him could see that. He had grown up with modest means, clawed his way through a state university on partial scholarship, and spent his 20s grinding through mid-level corporate roles with the intensity of someone running from poverty and towards something he hadn't yet been able to name. He was charming in the way ambitious men often are, attentive, quick with a compliment, always aware of who in the room had power. When he joined Wynn Capital Group as a senior associate, he made it his mission to be indispensable. He stayed late. He volunteered for the difficult accounts. He learned everything about Celeste Wynn's business philosophy and began echoing it back to her in meetings with just enough original spin to seem brilliant. Within 18 months, he had earned 2 promotions. Within 2 years, he was sitting in rooms where deals worth hundreds of millions were made over coffee. He had wanted this his entire life, and he was not going to let anything slow him down. including the woman he had married before any of this started. Sarah Calloway had met Dalton Pierce when they were both young and broke and full of hope. She was 26. He was 28. They met through a mutual friend at a small dinner party in a cramped apartment, and something clicked between them immediately. He talked about his dreams with a fire she found magnetic. She listened with a warmth he found rare. They dated for 8 months and married in a simple ceremony with 40 guests, a borrowed venue, and a cake that was slightly lopsided. Neither of them had much money, but they had each other, and Sarah, at least, believed that was enough. She was the kind of woman who loved quietly and gave generously. When Dalton struggled during his first few years, passed over for promotions, frustrated and humiliated, and sometimes barely holding himself together, it was Sarah who talked him through the dark nights. It was Sarah who picked up extra consulting work when their savings ran thin. It was Sarah who put her own ambitions on pause, shelving a promising career in financial analysis, because Dalton's schedule left no room for two people to be building their lives at the same time. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that once he got established, things would balance out. She believed in him the way only someone who truly loves you can believe in you, with her whole chest, without conditions. And for a while, it felt like it was working. When Dalton finally got the big promotion at Wynn Capital, they celebrated in their small kitchen with a bottle of wine they couldn't really afford, and Dalton held her face in his hands and said, "We did it, Sarah. We actually did it." She cried a little. He kissed her forehead. It felt like the beginning of the life they had always been working toward. She didn't know it was the beginning of the end. The invitations started coming. Business dinners, charity events, corporate cocktail parties, and penthouses overlooking the city skyline. Dalton's world was changing rapidly, and Sarah was suddenly standing in rooms that seemed to be written in a language she hadn't studied. The women wore shoes that cost more than a month of their old rent. The conversations were a constant performance of status, vacation homes, private club memberships, investment portfolios dropped casually into small talk like punctuation. Sarah was intelligent. She was well-read. She was, by any reasonable measure, accomplished. But she was quiet in those rooms. She didn't perform. She didn't posture. She stood at Dalton's side with a glass of wine and a genuine smile, and mostly listened. And she noticed, slowly and with growing unease, that Dalton had begun looking at her differently in those spaces. Not with pride, with something closer to discomfort. Like she was a detail he hadn't accounted for. Like she reminded him of a version of himself he was trying to leave behind. He started small. A comment about her dress at one event. Maybe something a little more formal next time. Then a remark about her career gap. Celeste asked what you do, and I didn't really know what to say. Then the tone shifts. The impatience. Coming home from business trips, distracted and short-tempered. Answering her questions with half attention. The space between them began to feel less like distance and more like absence. And Sarah, who noticed everything, began to understand that something was being decided without her. She just didn't yet know what. Dalton and Celeste Wynn had been traveling together for months by that point. International conferences, investor summits in London and Singapore and Dubai. The official story was business. Always business. And perhaps in the beginning, it was. But Celeste was a woman who got what she wanted. And somewhere between a boardroom in Zurich and a private dinner in Milan, what she wanted became Dalton Pierce. He was ambitious. He was attentive. He was available in all the ways that matter to a powerful woman who has spent her life making decisions. And Dalton, a man who had spent his entire adult life chasing elevation, found himself standing next to the most powerful woman in his world and felt something shift inside him. Not love exactly, but proximity to power. And for Dalton, those two things had always looked the same. The morning Dalton asked for a divorce was a Tuesday. Sarah had made coffee. There was soft morning light coming through the kitchen window. She remembered that detail later, the ordinary softness of that light, because it became the last image she had of the life she thought she was living. He sat down across from her and said the words without looking directly at her face. I think we want different things. I think our lives have moved in different directions. I think this isn't working anymore. He spoke in the careful language of someone who had rehearsed. She sat very still. She asked him if there was someone else. He paused 1 second too long. And in that second, she already knew. She found out the truth within a week. Corporate circles talk. A colleague of Dalton's, someone who clearly felt guilty about the whole thing, mentioned it quietly at a networking event Sarah attended alone, out of stubbornness, out of a refusal to disappear quietly. Dalton and Celeste win. It was already known. Already the subject of gossip among the people who had spent years attending the same events where Sarah stood quietly at Dalton's side and smiled. The divorce proceedings were the worst months of her life. Not because Dalton was aggressive. He was worse than aggressive. He was cold, efficient. He moved through the legal process with the same ruthless precision he applied to business deals, as if their marriage were an underperforming asset he was liquidating. At the final hearing, Celeste Wynn sat in the back of the room. She didn't need to be there. She chose to be there. She sat with her legs crossed and her designer bag in her lap, and she watched the entire proceeding with the calm expression of someone observing a transaction they've already won. Dalton looked at Sarah across the table and said, in front of their lawyers and a family court judge, that she had held him back. Those exact words. That she represented a chapter of his life he had outgrown. The judge kept her expression neutral. Sarah kept hers neutral too. But something inside her chest tore quietly and completely in that moment. Something that would take a very long time to grow back. Dalton and Celeste married 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Business media covered it like a merger announcement. Power couple formalizes their union. Photos of them at their wedding in Tuscany. Celeste in a white gown that probably cost 6 figures. Dalton looking like the man he had always wanted to become, standing next to the woman he had decided was going to take him there. Sarah saw the article on her phone in her new apartment. A small, sparse place with secondhand furniture and boxes she hadn't finished unpacking. And she put the phone face down on the floor and sat with the silence for a long time. The months that followed were the kind of hard that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. She wasn't crumbling in any visible way. She went to work. She paid her bills. She responded to messages from the few friends who still called. But inside, she was carrying the weight of what it feels like to discover that the life you built, the sacrifices you made, the years you gave, were apparently worth nothing to the person you gave them to. She felt invisible in a way she hadn't expected. Not sad exactly, more like erased. Like she had been a supporting character in a story that had moved on without her, and now she was standing in the margin wondering what the point of her had been. But something else was happening underneath the grief. Something quieter and more durable. A slow fire. She started reading. Finance journals. Business case studies. The same material she had set aside years ago when she chose to support Dalton's ambitions over her own. She enrolled in an online business course at night after work. She took a consulting job at a small financial firm, entry level, well beneath her intelligence, and she treated every task like a lesson. She asked questions. She took notes. She built. Not because she had a plan yet, but because building was the only thing that felt like moving forward. And forward was the only direction that mattered. The letter came on an ordinary Thursday morning. A law firm she had never heard of. A name she barely recognized. A distant relative on her mother's side. An uncle twice removed. The kind of family connection so faint it barely registered as family at all. He had passed away quietly, the letter said. No spouse. No children. A private and reclusive man who had spent 40 years building something that most people around him never knew existed. And he had left all of it to Sarah. She had to read the letter 3 times before she believed what it was saying. The estate included property in 3 states. A portfolio of private investments. Several business interests, including a mid-sized investment management firm called Callaway and Partners, a name that made her pause, the kind of coincidence that doesn't feel like a coincidence, that had been operating quietly and profitably for over 2 decades. The total value of the inheritance was not yet fully assessed, the letter said, but preliminary estimates placed it well above $40 million. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with that letter in her hands for a very long time. The apartment was quiet. The second-hand furniture was exactly the same. The boxes from her move were still half unpacked in the corner, and the world had just changed completely. She didn't celebrate. She didn't call anyone. She cried a little, but not from happiness, from something more complicated than that. Relief, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to purpose. She called the law firm the next morning, composed and careful, and began the process of understanding exactly what she had inherited. Over the following weeks, she met with estate lawyers, financial advisors, and the existing leadership of Callaway and Partners. What she found was a firm with strong bones and poor recent management. It had drifted without clear direction since its founder, her distant uncle, had stepped back from active oversight. The talent was there. The client relationships were there. But it needed leadership, real leadership, someone who understood both the numbers and the people. She looked at the firm, and she recognized something in it. A quiet thing that had been overlooked. A thing with more value than anyone around it seemed to understand. She recognized it because she had felt that way herself for years. She decided she would run it herself. The first year was a masterclass in humility. She made mistakes. She hired one advisor who turned out to be more interested in positioning himself for her role than in helping her succeed, and she had to let him go swiftly and cleanly, a decision that cost her 3 months of momentum. She was too cautious with one major client relationship and nearly lost it. She was too aggressive with a market position and had to course-correct at some personal financial cost. But she learned from every single misstep with the focus of someone who understands that failure is only permanent if you stop moving. She surrounded herself with people who were honest with her, not people who told her what she wanted to hear, but people who told her what she needed to know. She worked with the kind of discipline that comes from spending years watching someone else get credit for your investment. And gradually, then quickly, things began to shift. By the end of year 2, Callaway and Partners had restructured its 3 largest accounts and grown its managed portfolio by 31%. By year 3, they were being written about in financial trade publications as one of the most quietly impressive mid-market investment firms in the country. Sarah rarely gave interviews. She let the results speak. Her reputation in financial circles grew not from self-promotion, but from the most durable kind of credibility, the kind that other serious professionals recognize in each other because they've seen what it looks like to actually know what you're doing. She did not forget what had happened to her, but she stopped carrying it as a wound. Somewhere along the way, the story of Dalton Pierce and Celeste Wynn had become less of a source of pain and more of a source of clarity. It had shown her exactly who she was when everything was taken away, and she turned out to be considerably more than she, or anyone else, had given her credit for. Hey, if you are still with this story right now, I need you to pause for 1 second and drop a comment that says "still watching." Because what's about to happen next is the part that makes everything worth it, and I want to know that you're here for it. While Sarah was building, Dalton and Celeste were beginning to unravel. It happened the way it always happens with people who mistake proximity to power for actual capability. The first few years of their marriage had gone well enough on the surface. Celeste was still running Wynn Capital Group. Dalton had been elevated to a senior executive role within the firm, a move that was openly understood in corporate circles as less about merit and more about the marriage. He had the title. He had the office. He had the car and the travel and the dinner parties that had once felt like everything worth wanting. But he was operating in rooms where the tolerance for weakness was zero, and without Celeste's direct protection, his decisions were increasingly scrutinized. Several acquisitions he championed underperformed. A major partnership he negotiated publicly fell apart within 18 months. Investors who had respected Celeste's judgment began asking quiet questions about the quality of the leadership beneath her. Celeste, for her part, had made a category error that brilliant people sometimes make. She had confused admiration for competence. Dalton admired her intensely. He was good at performing competence in her presence. But admiration and performance are not the same as the real thing, and the gap between what Dalton appeared to be and what he actually was had begun showing up on balance sheets. Their personal relationship became increasingly tense as professional pressure mounted. The dynamic that had felt electric in the context of an affair, the power, the intensity, the mutual ambition, became something else entirely when the ambition started producing failure instead of success. They remained publicly aligned, because that was the smart play. But the private reality was considerably colder. By the time of the Whitmore Charitable Investment Gala, Wynn Capital Group was in a precarious position. 3 years of mixed results. Key investors reviewing their commitments. And a significant new deal that they needed outside financing to close. A deal that would require a partner with both the capital and the market credibility to make it viable. They had come to this gala specifically because they knew that a well-placed relationship formed at an event like this could save everything they had built. They were not in the room as power. They were in the room as need. They just hadn't let themselves admit that yet. And then the host said her name. "Please welcome the new owner, Sarah Calloway." Dalton heard it from across the room. He looked up, and the woman walking toward that stage in the navy gown, composed, unhurried, completely and utterly in command of the space around her, was the woman he had sat across from in a family court and called a chapter he had outgrown. His mind did that thing minds do when they encounter something they are not prepared for. It tried to construct an alternative explanation. Maybe it was a different Sarah Calloway. It was not a common name, but it wasn't impossible. Maybe she had taken a position with some firm and was being introduced in a ceremonial capacity. Maybe this was some kind of impossible coincidence. These explanations lasted approximately 45 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for Sarah to reach the podium, survey the room with those calm, dark eyes, and for her gaze to pass, just briefly, just for a single measured second, over the table where he was sitting. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply noted him the way you note furniture in a room you once lived in. And then she looked back at the crowd and began to speak. Celeste's hand found Dalton's arm under the table. Not affectionately. As a signal. She had recognized Sarah first. She had done the math faster than he had. Because Celeste Wynn was, whatever her moral failings, extraordinarily quick. She understood in the span of about 30 seconds that the woman her husband had called ordinary, the woman she had once watched from the back of a courtroom, as if she were watching someone's luggage being cleared from a departure gate, now ran the company that could determine whether Wynn Capital Group survived the next financial quarter. She kept her expression perfectly controlled, which was the only tell that she was not perfectly calm. Sarah spoke about Calloway and Partners' investment philosophy, about long-term value over short-term extraction, about the kind of partnerships that were built on integrity rather than urgency. She was compelling not because she performed warmth, but because she radiated certainty. The room listened. Even the people in that room who had never heard her name before tonight could feel that this was a person who had earned the space she was standing in. Afterward, during the cocktail hour, Dalton made his way toward her. He had told himself he would be composed, professional. He would treat it like a business interaction and set aside the personal history. He had convinced himself, in the 20 minutes between her speech and this moment, that there was a version of this conversation where she would hear him out and the deal would proceed, because that was the rational outcome, and Sarah had always been rational. She had always been the steady one, the forgiving one. He had counted on that quality of hers for years without acknowledging it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he was counting on it now. Sarah. He said her name with the careful warmth of a man who has been practicing. "I have to say, this is remarkable. What you've done with the firm is genuinely impressive. I always knew you had this in you." She looked at him. No performance. No visible anger. Just clarity. "Did you, Dalton?" she said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. He pressed forward because pressing forward was all he knew how to do. He mentioned the deal, the opportunity, the mutual benefit. He mentioned that they had history, and he meant it as a bridge, as a foundation for goodwill, not understanding that she was hearing the same word in an entirely different register. History. Yes, they had history. She had the receipts of it stored carefully in the part of herself that had rebuilt everything from nothing. She let him finish. Then she said, very calmly, with people nearby listening just closely enough, "I remember the last time we sat across a table from each other, Dalton. You said I held you back. You said you had outgrown me." She paused. "I've thought about those words a great deal over the past several years. They were actually quite useful." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm going to pass on the deal, but I want you to know that it's not personal. Callaway and Partners doesn't enter partnerships where the fundamentals don't support long-term stability. And I don't think Win Capital's current position reflects the fundamentals we're looking for." She said it without cruelty, without theater, without the trembling satisfaction of revenge, which is what lesser storytellers would give you here. She said it the way you state a fact that has been true for some time and simply needed to be said out loud. Dalton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came. Celeste Wynne, who had positioned herself close enough to overhear, stood very still. Around them, conversations had quieted just enough. A few people had turned, sensing something significant in the air the way people do at these events when the performance drops and something real appears beneath it. A photographer 2 tables over had gone from casually documenting cocktail hour to very deliberately not looking away. Dalton Pierce stood in the most important room of his career and understood, fully and completely, what he had destroyed and what he had lost and what would never be available to him again. Not just the deal, not just the financing, but something he had given away voluntarily years ago in a kitchen on a Tuesday morning with soft light coming through the window, when he looked at a woman who had given him everything and decided she wasn't enough. The aftermath was swift in the way that financial consequences always are when confidence has already been eroding. Word spread through the gala that Callaway and Partners had declined to engage with Win Capital. In rooms like this, that kind of signal travels fast and lands hard. 2 other potential partners who had been in early conversations with Celeste's firm quietly shelved those discussions within the following weeks. The deal Dalton had championed collapsed without the outside financing. A quarterly report released in the following months confirmed what informed insiders had been speculating for over a year. Win Capital Group was contracting, not growing. Celeste's influence in the market, which had once seemed untouchable, was visibly diminishing. The power couple coverage disappeared, replaced by more measured, more skeptical analysis of the firm's direction. Sarah did not watch any of this closely. She had other things to build. She left the gala that night the way she had arrived, quietly, without fanfare, without needing the room to acknowledge what had just happened. She got into a car outside and leaned her head back against the seat and looked out the window at the city moving past. She thought about the small apartment with the second-hand furniture. She thought about the kitchen with the soft morning light. She thought about a younger version of herself sitting across from a lawyer with her hands folded on a table, holding herself together through sheer will. She thought about all the mornings she had woken up and chosen to move forward when everything inside her wanted to stop. She didn't feel triumphant. That surprised her a little. She had sometimes imagined that this kind of moment would feel like triumph. What she actually felt was something quieter and more complete, like a circle closing, like the final note of something that had been playing for a very long time. She had not gone to that gala to deliver justice. She had gone because she owned a company that deserved to be represented there, and she was the person who ran it, and that was reason enough. The rest had simply unfolded the way truth tends to unfold when you stop running from it. The greatest revenge, she had come to understand, is not what you do to the people who hurt you. It's what you build from the rubble they left behind. It's who you become when you had every reason to become bitter and chose something harder and more durable instead. It's standing in a room where you are the most powerful person present and feeling nothing but quiet, deep, earned peace. And if there's one thing this story teaches, it's this. The people who underestimate you are counting on you to stay small. They need you to stay exactly where they left you, because your growth is a mirror that reflects everything they chose to sacrifice to get where they are. Sarah Calloway did not stay small. She did not stay in the margin of someone else's story. She wrote her own. From the rubble, from the grief, from the early mornings and the secondhand furniture and the letters from law firms she had never heard of and the companies she rebuilt with her own hands and her own mind and a kind of quiet, unbreakable belief in herself that no one could take from her because she had found it entirely on her own. Dalton Pierce had once told her she was a chapter he had outgrown. She turned out to be the whole book. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've survived, share it with them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. The most powerful comebacks are always the ones that happen quietly, and we tell those stories here every single time. I'll see you in the next one.